Math is everywhere. Now, as you're going through your career in math, you're probably thinking about some of your experiences you've had with math at an educational level, either in grammar school, middle school, high school, or now in college, if you are in college. Now, what you probably haven't thought about, probably since grammar school, is how easy, or how about this, how non complicated math can be. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the most complex things you've learned about math and the most advanced things you've learned about math, you've learned in grammar school. More about that in a little bit. As you progress, going through grammar school and middle school and high school, math started to lose its focus a little bit. So by the time you got into high school, math really didn't represent anything to you in most cases, or maybe it did, where you just would look at math for the sake of math, either if you were in pre-algebra, algebra, geometry, anything like that. You started thinking of math as just being a bunch of gobbledygooks of numbers that were kind of all together, that either you were right or not right, correct or incorrect, depending on whatever your teacher was saying. So my point is after a while, math lost a lot of context to you as you were progressing through your education and learning more about it. Now, as I pointed out, when you were in grammar school, you learned probably about 80% or a great majority of everything you learned about math. And you also learned some very important math concepts. For example, when you're in just your early grades, when you were before, when you were 10 years old or younger, you learn things such as addition and subtraction, where you would add things together and you would subtract things. Then you would learn multiplication, and then you would learn division. Now, believe it or not, those are the four things or the four operations that you need to learn before you could do any kind of more advanced math. But the concepts are the same. What you're doing is you're looking at numbers and you're using them to describe the world around you. And that's all math is. Math, in my opinion, is a language, just like English or Spanish or Polish, Russian, whatever language you may speak. Math is a language just like that. We use English or natural language or Polish or Spanish to describe things, right? We use it to communicate. We use language to describe things around us and to communicate that with people. That's all math is. But what math is math gives us a way that we can look at the world around us and we can describe the world around us and then communicate those things. Now, going back to what you learned in grammar school, you learned numbers, and you learned that numbers can be added together, subtracted, multiplied, or divided. So basically, those were based on observations. Now, when you progress in math and you progress into some of the more obscure levels of mathematics, you're going to find out that a lot of these numbers have properties just in their own right. And there's different kinds of numbers. We probably don't think about that when we start doing our math problems, because everything to us is kind of all blended together. But you have numbers that describe quantities, like positive numbers. Like you could look and see how many race cars there are, or how many drivers there are, or how many people are in the racetrack, things like that. So you can look at the world around you and you could put quantities on those numbers. You can also have other numbers too that describe, things that might be fractions. Like, for example, you might see 9 people in the racetrack, or you might see 7 cars, or you might see, 2 fire trucks. But you don't see fractions of them. You don't see 1.5 fire trucks or 1.5 tow trucks or 17.5 people. So if you think about that, numbers have different properties, where some numbers describe whole quantities and some numbers describe partial quantities. There's also some numbers that don't fit into any of this, and those are called imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers are kind of their own topic and certainly aren't going to be covered all here. But for example, you don't see negative quantities. Like if you look at the video, you might see, if 75 people in the stands, or 17 cars, one guy with a flag. But you don't see negative numbers, do you? You don't see negative cars or negative tow trucks or negative anything. So negative numbers, just based on what I've been discussing with you, are different than positive numbers, aren't they? Where negative numbers don't describe quantities and they don't describe anything that we observe, but they describe the absence of quantities. So basically, negative numbers aren't really observable where positive numbers are. And positive numbers, like I said, kind of fall into at least two categories, at least in the few minutes that we went over them, where you have whole numbers and you have what I call partial numbers, but they're called real numbers, that have decimals in them. So as you can see, even just based on the simple examples that I've given you over the past few minutes, math is really broken down not just into describing the world around you, but also in understanding the numbers that make it up. Now, this is kind of pie in the sky stuff with you, and a lot of this, unfortunately, I think was kind of passed over as you learned about math, because it's, I think as educators, we look at that and say, oh, you know what, that's kind of obvious, and we're not going to point this out to the young person that's learning math. But I think that's a disservice, because we're not really teaching, and you're not learning, the properties of numbers and how the different kinds of numbers fit into math and fit into what I call the language of math, into how we learn math to describe things. Just like you learned when you were small, you learned how to speak a natural language or your mother tongue. Math is just like that. Now imagine if you took your mother tongue or what you've learned, how to speak or communicate, like my natural language is English. So imagine if I went to class in grammar school and middle school and high school for English, and it never really described how to talk and communicate, but just was the forensics of it. Like, for example, a good example would be like a spelling test. So every week I'd have a spelling test, that would gauge my accomplishment in learning the language. I'm really not learning the language, am I? I'm just learning how to do something with it, like spell. Certainly valuable, but it kind of misses the point where passing a spelling test doesn't help me communicate. And that's the same thing with math. When you started doing, algebra or pre-algebra, learning that didn't necessarily help prepare you for communicating in math. And a lot of it has to do with skipping over the properties of numbers, what makes numbers important and what makes numbers different. And as I mentioned, you learn almost everything you need to know about the properties of numbers when you're very small. You already have that knowledge in you. So it's not like you need to look at math and look for knowledge that you need to acquire. I say that you should look at what you already have and take what you already know about numbers and math and expand on that. Now, I just mentioned previously that we have numbers and we have the properties of numbers, right? Where we have, in the simple example, and I'm painting with a very broad brush, by the way, you have positive numbers, you have negative numbers. Positive numbers fit into a special kind of category where you might have integral numbers or whole numbers, and you might have numbers or describe things that aren't whole. Like, for example, you can have 1.5 apples or 1 3/4, hot dogs or 3.5 beers or something like that, where, in more whole numbers, you would describe that as people. Like, or for example, like you have 4 brothers and 3 sisters. So there's also a special category of numbers that I'm going to point out now, and that is 0. 0 is a problem, and let me tell you why. Our positive numbers are things that we can observe. Like in our example here, we can observe the number of cars. We can observe the number of tow trucks. We can observe the number of people. We can observe those and put quantities on them. Like I mentioned, you have X amount of cars, 10 people, 18 tow trucks. Negative numbers are not observable in nature. We can't look at this and say that there's negative things. Also, 0 is a problem because 0 is the absence of everything. And it gives us a problem in a lot of different ways. For example, we can't look at the screen and say, how many elephants do we have? I'm being silly on purpose. 0. How many giraffes do we have? 0. How many ships do we have? None. How many spaceships do we have? 0. So it goes on and on. So we can observe different things in this video, but we cannot observe the number of 0 things that we see. So the number of 0 things that we see is infinite, isn't it? Where we can go on and on and on and never run out of 0 things that we see. So 0 in a lot of ways is the confluence between infinity and the absence of anything. 0 also has a problem because we can't sum it. If we have 1,000 observations of 0 or an infinite amount of observations with 0, they all sum to nothing. So 0 is the absence of quantity. So with the absence of quantity, we also have problems such as we can't divide by 0 or anything of that nature. So as you learn more and more and more about numbers, think about the kinds of numbers that you're using and what they're used for. Think about the positive numbers that you use to describe quantities, the negative numbers that you use to describe the absence of quantities, and 0, which you're going to find out throughout your math career is a problem because 0 may not be a number depending on how you look at it after all. I know that's a subject for debate, and that's actually a very good conversation to have over a couple of cold beverages, that if 0 is actually a number or not a number. You can make the argument either way on that. That's all I had for you today. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.